Welcome everybody to the philosophy panel 2. This is the second panel on philosophy we have as part of this international boredom conference. I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Andreas Elpidorou, from the University of Louisville, who will present a paper titled Boredom, Poverty, and Social Justice. So to introduce a little bit his short bio, Andreas is an academic philosopher and writer. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the mentioned university. He specializes in the philosophical study of the mind and has published extensively on the nature of emotions, especially boredom, and others such as consciousness and cognition. He is best known for his work on the function and value of boredom. His most recent book, Propelled, How Boredom, Frustration, and Anticipation Lead Us to the Good Life, explores how boredom and other emotions and states of discontent can help us live a more flourishing life. He is currently working on a monograph on boredom, tentatively titled The Anatomy of Boredom. Please, Andreas, when you want to start.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Josefa. Thank you, Marius, for organizing the conference. Thank you for doing a superb job. And it's been amazing and very, very enlightening to be here. I want to thank the presenters for sharing their work and for all the inspiring sessions. I learned a lot, and it's been a pleasure. And I apologize for missing a couple of the 4 a.m. sessions here. I'll make sure to catch up on them when the videos are available. It's just a little bit too early at 4 a.m. Before I begin, I am not in like my preferred location, so I'm not either home nor at an office. So there's a fridge next to me that's making loud noises. And let me know if I disappear. I'll be back, but I hope the technology that I have here is okay. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Okay, so I hope you're able to see this. Can't see anybody. If you're not able to see the keynote or the presentation, please let me know. So great, thanks again for being here. I will talk about the relationship between boredom and poverty today, and that will be my focus. And my starting point is going to be, I think, a kind of an intuitive, familiar starting point, and that has to do with the prevalence of boredom. And most of us are affected by boredom, and we heard about this in previous talks, some of the statistics, some of the research that shows that. And so boredom is a widespread psychological phenomenon. And in the recent years, there's a rich and productive program, and mostly empirical research program, that has affirmed the importance and existence of boredom as a psychological phenomenon. And by psychological, I mean a phenomenon that is on the personal level. And here I'm going to focus on human boredom just to make my claims a little bit more clear. And however, and there's a big but here, for me and perhaps for others, I think boredom is social as much as it is personal. And this is a dimension that's missing in my way of thinking about boredom, but I think it's an obvious dimension of boredom, and the sociologists amongst us and the anthropologists know this much better than I do. But I've been focusing on the personal level of boredom, and I realized that I need to expand my scope. And so there's very interesting work and very illuminating work on the kind of the social components of boredom. And I want to kind of bring together the personal and the social. And so this is one of the first steps that I'm taking in this presentation. And specifically, I'm going to look at two social dimensions of boredom. The first one has to do with the antecedents or elicitors of boredom. And I'm going to think about the ways in which they can be socially determined. And I think this is obvious to a lot of people that, our situations are socially determined. And because they're socially determined, when and how boredom arises will be also socially determined. What I want to add to this is that often the social determinants of boredom might be hidden from us because they might be rooted in historical and systemic factors that are not easily discernible. The other point that I'm going to hopefully try to argue for it is that the experience of boredom might be socially determined as well. How we experience boredom has to do with the cultural and social factors that are around us. And so my aim is to articulate some of the ways, clearly not all, and a lot of this will be suggestive, in which our social standing affects and perhaps even transforms the experience of boredom. And I will argue that boredom doesn't affect us all in the same way, even though we're all affected in some way by boredom. We're not all affected in the same way. And specifically, my focus will be on individuals of low socioeconomic status. And I'm going to argue, suggest, provide a model to think that low SES individuals are disproportionately negatively impacted by boredom. And that has to do, it doesn't have to do anything about any individual characteristics. It just has to do with their social standing and their social membership. And those negative effects that are disproportional to lower SES groups indicate, I believe, profound ways that boredom might affect individuals and might even further make their position even worse of those who are already marginalized. And so I think this is a big issue that needs to be discussed. And so that's part of the last part of my title is, I think boredom in some sense should be considered to be a social justice issue. And I'm not the first person to say something like this, and this has been around for a while. But I think it's important for me, at least, to start thinking about the ways that the social factors and the personal factors may come together. And so there's interesting work. I know Marius has a paper, co-authored paper on a sociological approach of boredom that talks a lot about how to understand boredom from a sociological perspective. John Eastwood, in a recent chapter with Dana Gorelick, have a great paper about discussing similar issues about kind of the social dimension of boredom. I think some of the things that I'm going to say echo Josefa's comments and findings about boredom in the elderly. I'm just looking at a different social class, I believe. So there's a lot of work in there, and there's a lot of work that's done before that informs this work that I'm doing right now. Just to give you a roadmap, I will talk very briefly about social class. That will take me maybe a minute or two. I will also talk briefly about boredom. I'm not going to spend too much time describing what boredom is. And then finally, I'm going to spend most of my time describing this model that I have in mind that I'm calling an interactionist model between boredom and poverty. And this is going to take the bulk of my time, and I need to do some work to justify the model. So a little bit about social class. Social class isn't something that exists independently of us. It is not a furniture of the world. And nonetheless, within our intersubjective context, it is a powerful and effective determinant of our existence in general. And we see this because on the basis of SES or social class, there are important cultural differences. We have different opportunities, different marriage or relational prospects, different educational attainment, and different access to social institutions. And furthermore, we also know that there are differences in physical and psychological well-being depending on your group, on your social class. So, for example, low SES individuals are vulnerable to physical disease and to greater health risk. They experience lower subjective well-being, more negative moods, or more chronic stress. And it is obvious, I think, that the lower you are, given the way the society is structured, the lower your SES is, the more harms and the more obstacles to your well-being you're going to encounter. So that prompts a question, and the question is, compared to everything else that low SES individuals have to endure, have to face, isn't boredom something that perhaps is a bit trivial in the sense that, we have other issues to consider? Why focus on boredom? And I'm going to make a case later on why it is important to consider boredom within this context. But I think the answer should be no, because we do know that as a chronic condition, boredom, or what we might call trait boredom, or boredom proneness, or existential boredom, or life boredom, is far from trivial. And so if individuals in lower SES or social classes are more likely to experience this type of prolonged life boredom, existential boredom, then they're also in danger to inherit the harms associated with boredom proneness. So there's at least one reason to take this very, very seriously. And there are other reasons that we can articulate later. So that's all I have to say about social class. I'm going to move to boredom, and I'm going to give a quite an opinionated but very short introduction to what I take to be the state of boredom. And I'm treating boredom more or less as an emotion for the purposes of this presentation. So I take it to be an experientially unpleasant state that involves a strong desire to engage in an alternative situation. And in John Eastwood's paper and colleagues' paper that they summarized different approaches to boredom, different theories of boredom, definitions. This seems to be kind of an ecumenical definition of boredom that rings true to me. It is associated both with attentional difficulties, but also with negative appraisals. And specifically, I think what's important to highlight here is the perception of meaninglessness of one situation. There are additional aspects to boredom that I'm not going to focus on, however, here. But I do want to emphasize that I take it to be given its aversive experience or it's an unpleasant state, I take it to be a bothersome reminder in some ways that we find ourselves in a situation that there is a perceived mismatch between what we want to be doing and what we're actually doing. But at the same time, there is this desire to do something else. So it also involves a motivating force that compels us to do something else. And in doing that, to make its presence go away. And so we might want to rephrase this and say that boredom is an aversively felt warning that we have found ourselves in an unsatisfactory situation. And at the same time, given I think there are these two features of boredom that I highlight, there is the warning part and there's the pushing or the motivating part. I take it to be also be a call on us to move out of our current state of discontent and perhaps into something else, right? Hopefully it's something that is going to alleviate boredom. What needs to be underlined here, and this is kind of the impetus of the presentation and the paper, is that boredom on its own cannot guarantee that we will be able to find something better. The mere fact that we experience boredom is not a solution. It's perhaps, it is an alarm, but not the solution. And this means that boredom, we might frame it and we might say it's a push for change, but it's not a guarantee, not the assurance of one. And there are at least two ways in which things can go wrong, okay? And there are easy ways to understand. Sometimes we're just stuck and we're unable to change our situation. Think of, for instance, that you have to attend a meeting and it's a long meeting and you cannot leave the meeting. You might be bored, but being bored isn't going to help you not being bored because of the situational constraint. Or think about having a really, really long shift. Well, you're not going to feel better until the shift ends if you find the shift boring. So to be able to help ourselves get out of boredom, we must also have the resources, the freedom, and the energy to do so. But even if we have all that, that doesn't mean that any change out of boredom is going to be a change for the better. And so I want to emphasize here that without access to the right resources of alternative engagement and without guidance and the know-how as to what might be worth pursuing, it's easy to choose, perhaps with quotation marks here, the wrong way out of boredom. And this, for me, highlights a problem of boredom that becomes pronounced when we're dealing with certain specific social groups. And the problem of boredom is that if, as an agent, or if an agent lacks the necessary material and psychological resources, we might not be able to respond productively or properly to boredom. And that might turn boredom into something more substantial and something that is hard to bear and perhaps even a threat to our well-being. And here lies, I believe, the capacity of boredom to turn unjust. Because if we think of social groups that because of their social and material standing, they are already at a position that it's really hard for them to respond to boredom, then the onset of boredom is going to make their situation even worse. Okay, and so that is how I started thinking about this idea of the relationship better, the link between social class and boredom. And this goes back to this realization that, yes, boredom affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. Okay. And now I'm going to turn to the third part of the presentation, which is going to be take up most of the time, and it's going to take much more of my effort to make this work, to make the argument. And I'm going to offer a model here, what I'm calling an interactionist model of the influence of poverty on boredom. And these are just 3 ways of thinking about how low SES and conditions of material scarcity might affect boredom. And I'm highlighting 3 pathways. And I'm going to argue that SES will affect the frequency, or is likely to affect the frequency of the onset of boredom. That will be pathway 1. It is likely that it's going to affect the experience of boredom, pathway 2, and likely that it's going to affect the ability to respond to boredom, pathway 3. And I'm going to spend most of my time arguing for pathway 1. Apparently takes a long time to argue for that point, so bear with me. I hope it's not too boring. And then I'll spend not so much time articulating my thoughts and presenting my thoughts about the other 2 pathways. And so starting to think about what might be the link between poverty and boredom in terms of the eliciting or antecedent conditions of boredom, right? To understand how social class might relate to the occurrence and frequency of boredom, we need to look to kind of the typical or common or the most important antecedents of boredom. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm sure most of you, you're all familiar with this. There are a lot of them. But I'm going to focus on 3. And I'm going to focus on the presence of constraint, attentional difficulties, and perceived meaninglessness. And I'm focusing on those 3 for 2 reasons. First, I think those are important antecedents of boredom. A lot of people agree that those seem to be eliciting or even causing the experience of boredom. The second reason why I'm focusing on 1, 2, 3 is because I think those are important within the context of poverty. And my argument will look something like this. I'm going to present 1, 2, 3, and ultimately I'm going to show that poverty or conditions of material scarcity give rise to 1, 2, 3, but 1, 2, 3 give rise to boredom. And so that would be how I'm going to argue for the first pathway. I'm going to take this in reverse, though, just to make the argument a little bit easier. Now I'm going to start by presenting how 1, 2, 3 are in fact antecedents or eliciting conditions or perhaps causes of boredom. And that's not going to be the hard part of my argument. I hope it's not the hard part of my argument. And then I'll come back and argue how poverty can lead to 1, 2, and 3. All right, so if first we might ask, what is the relationship between boredom and constraint? And we heard previous talks, I'm going to mention a few things here, that there's a close relationship between the 2. It's not that constraint or the presence of constraints or lack of freedom necessarily gives rise to boredom, but it is something that's important to consider when we want to bore somebody in a lab or when we want to make sense of someone's experiences of boredom. And so the literature reports a close relationship between the 2. In fact, some people have included constraint in their own theoretical explications of the character of boredom. There are reports that organizational constraints might cause workplace boredom. There are findings showing or suggesting that lack of constraint choice reduces boredom. And there are other findings showing that perceived autonomy and lack of control may play a causal role in the experience of boredom. And there's some other findings that I don't need to go over them right now. But the idea is that, yes, it makes sense to put the 2 together. Yes, it makes sense to treat constraint as a potential or a possible antecedent of boredom. What about boredom and attention? And here in the literature, there's a close relationship between boredom and attention as well. And the relationship is well supported in the literature. So I mentioned 3 papers there that are very useful discussions if you're interested in the psychology literature of the link between the 2. Some findings suggestive of that relationship. We know that there's a relationship between boredom proneness and attentional difficulties. We know that the experience of boredom is associated with sustained attention tasks. Some accounts of boredom make attentional difficulties a proper part of boredom. It is a necessary component of boredom, whereas others make attentional difficulties a sufficient condition of boredom. And there are other findings suggestive of that relationship. So I will also claim that there's good evidence to suggest there's a close connection between attention and boredom. And the same holds for boredom and the perception of lack of meaning. That relationship is also well documented in the literature. So just to give a sociological approach here, boredom is both, Barber-led boredom is seen to be both a signal of perceived meaninglessness and a drive to seek meaning. Experimental support suggesting that perceived meaningless appears to be both an antecedent or cause of boredom, perhaps even an essential part of its experience, at least of some kind of boredom, is intimately related to perceived meaninglessness. And then there's also a correlational relationship between the presence of state and trait boredom and perceived meaninglessness. And so I think, you know, 1, 2, 3, I think individually, they're important antecedents or eliciting conditions of boredom. Put them together, very likely that you're going to get bored. All right. So what now I need to argue is, all right, why do I think that boredom is related, and how exactly it is related to 1, the presence of constraint, 2, attentional difficulties, and 3, perceived meaninglessness. And for someone, this is going to be a little bit tricky at the argument. So I want to see how it's going to fare with you all. What about low SES and constraints? I mean, here one of the difficulties of trying to articulate the relationship between the two is to start thinking, is to figure out how we want to think about low SES and poverty. And I'm going to highlight very quickly 3 ways of thinking about poverty and low SES. And I'm going to suggest that either one of them reveals a close connection to the presence of constraints. So one way of thinking about poverty is to measure it with some objective features of using some objective metrics. So tell me your income and I'll tell you your social class. Tell me your educational status and I'll tell you your social class. Or tell me your parents' wealth and I'll tell you your social class, or something like that. But if we start thinking about objective measures of poverty, then those, I believe, are really metrics of freedom and constraint. So income, education level, parents' wealth, neighborhood. These are metrics of how free we are and how constrained we are. So I think once economic, social, and cultural participation and our residential and professional choices are a factor of one's economic status. I mean, clearly, I wouldn't be able to present here if I didn't have a laptop, if I didn't have access to the internet. And so the less wealthy one is, the more restricted one's sets of choices and freedoms becomes. And I think this is kind of, it might be an obvious thing to state. Sometimes the obvious bears to be repeated. And there's also kind of some evidence to suggest that this is true even when you start probing into how the relationship between individuals' perceptions of their life and constraints and income and other objective metrics of poverty or SES. So just to mention one example, there's a positive association between, for instance, between income and increased reports of personal control in various domains of life. And that suggests that the way that we perceive the presence or absence of constraints has to do with some, what I'm calling here, objective metric of SES or poverty. And we might think of poverty, so there's a second way of thinking of poverty, using a subjective criterion or measure. And this is typically done, or social class in general, this is typically done by asking individuals to situate themselves in society, or in their neighborhood, or in their own culture, or in the country. And you ask them, you know, one way of doing this is to give them a ladder and ask them, you know, relative to everybody else in your society, which rung are you located? On which rung are you located? Are you in the lower ones or the higher ones? And there's some evidence that suggests that the way that individuals reason for figuring out their own relative socioeconomic position is affected by comparison. And that is a comparison between their own freedoms and the freedom of others. So how much freedom I have versus someone else's, or relative to someone else, is going to allow me to put myself either higher or lower on the social ladder. And so that just shows that even with a subjective measure of poverty, low SES or poverty is intimately related to our perception of constraints. And there's strong association, in addition to that, between subjective SES and financial security. A third way of thinking about poverty or low SES is to think about it through the adoption of what is known as a capabilities approach. And here I quote Marty Sen, defines poverty as a capability deprivation. That is, poverty is seen as the lack of the capability to live a minimally decent life. So if you're familiar with this approach, social approach, then the link between poverty and constraint is a definitional one. Poverty is just fundamentally an obstacle to individuals' exercise of their capabilities. So it is intimately related to the presence of constraints. Okay, so that will concludes the first link, I think. Let me talk about the other two. What about attention? This is far more complicated. And I'm gonna just discuss briefly the work by Nathan and Shafir in a book and a number of publications that they talk about this idea that poverty gives rise to a scarcity mindset, and this might affect decision-making and behavior. And the basic idea here is pretty simple. If you find yourself in conditions of scarcity, then you need to think about money and budgets and expenses all the time. But because you're thinking about money, expenses, and budgets all the time, those thoughts are taxing and stressing, and they consume your cognitive resources. And because they consume your cognitive resources, you're left with fewer cognitive resources for other things, for non-scarcity related demands and tasks. And there are various ways you can think about this trade-off. And I'm not going to get into the details here. For my purposes, there are two hypotheses that are relevant. One is that poverty directs our attention to scarcity-related issues, and because it does that, it might lead to the neglect of non-scarcity-related issues, which I just pay attention to my expenses, the things I have to pay. I just can't pay attention to other things. The other hypothesis is that scarcity has an adverse effect on mental bandwidth. And Shilbath and colleague described this as the brain's ability to perform the basic functions that underlie higher order behavior and decision making. I think the evidence supports one, extant evidence supports one. I'm not sure if it supports two, but I do just want to say that they're both relevant for the things that I'm considering here. Because if poverty causes a shift in our attention, then this shift could be responsible for the experience of boredom. Situations that otherwise would have captured our attention, they now don't. Okay? And so they might elicit the experience of boredom. If poverty reduces mental bandwidth, then that includes cognitive capacity and executive control, and that might be a big if, then boredom could arise because of such decreases in mental bandwidth. In conditions of material scarcity, I just lack the psychological resources to engage in a satisfactory manner with my situation or with my environment. Okay. And so this comes out of the scarcity theory or mindset approach. And there are other things to add here. I'm not going to dwell the point too much. But monetary worries are not the only threats to cognitive capacity and exercise and executive control and attention. Malnutrition, sleep deprivation, chronic pain also might impair cognitive function and might make it hard for us to attend to certain features of our situation. And those conditions are common amongst low SES individuals. All right, last part of the first pathway has to do with the arrow from poverty to perceived meaninglessness. And I think the theory makes it clear that there's a close relationship between poverty and perceived meaninglessness. And, I think this is not a hard claim to make. We're social beings, and we derive a lot of our meaning, a sense of meaningfulness, from participation in social activities. However, the poor tend to be marginalized and even excluded from such participation, and therefore it's going to be harder, not impossible, clearly, to have this that kind of meaning, or at least to retrieve that meaning from the same sources that we're retrieving the meaning. And there's empirical support for that contention. For instance, poverty is associated with feelings, perceptions of meaninglessness. individuals belonging in higher social classes were more likely to experience work meaning than individuals in lower social classes. I think if you worked at a job that doesn't pay well, it's not meaningful. It has a lot of constraints. It doesn't allow you to exercise your capabilities. So it makes it harder for you to find meaning in your work. And lastly, fascinating work on homeless population shows that homeless individuals experience difficulties in participating in social activities. And this has been shown that this exclusion results in profound and chronic experience of boredom and profound feelings of lack of meaning. So Marshall and all are doing incredible work on this, and Bruce O'Neill has a book and a few articles on studying the relationship between boredom and homelessness. And so this concludes the 3 arrows from poverty to constraint, meaninglessness, and intentional difficulties, and hopefully conclude kind of the first pathway and the indirect relationship, how we get from poverty to the more frequent experience of boredom. And I think this conclusion is partly in line with certain published findings that demonstrate a close relationship between higher rates of boredom and lower SES. Okay. There are 2 more pathways. I'm going to be much briefer discussing those 2. The second one has to do with the experience of boredom, right? And a thought that I have is that low SES or social standing might affect the experience of boredom. And one way of saying this, and I'm going to give a twofold argument for this. One way of saying this follows from what I've said about the first pathway. If low SES makes it more likely that boredom is going to become more frequent, then there are going to be important difference between experiencing boredom sparingly and as a response to a particular situational feature compared to experiencing frequently or even chronically. And we get that by interviewing individuals who experience life boredom or boredom proneness versus individuals who experience boredom in a specific situation. We also know that there's a positive correlational relationship between boredom proneness on the one hand, depression, anxiety, anger, and apathy on the other hand. So the emotional landscape of someone who experiences boredom frequently or chronically is different from the emotional landscape of those individuals who experience boredom here and there, and it's a situational kind of boredom. Lastly, for individuals in low SES, boredom's negative experience, I think, will be amplified or accompanied by strong feelings of lack of autonomy and constraint, perceived lack of personal control, and perceived meaninglessness. And that's going to make boredom even worse. So that's one part of the argument. The other part of the argument is, as we know, low SES and poverty is associated with stress. And poor individuals' experience of boredom, I think, is likely going to be colored by the phenomenological experience of stress that it's going to accompany and affect the way that they're experiencing the world. But their experience of boredom is also going to be affected by stress's physiological correlates. So there might be physiological differences in arousal, perhaps, on how people experience boredom depending on social class. And I'm not going to go into the details about low SES and stress, but there's a lot of work that A, theoretically supports the connection, and B, has provided strong empirical support for the connection between stress and low SES. And so the conclusion of the second pathway is that the boredom of low SES individuals, I think it will be more frequent, but it will also be more severe and perhaps of a different phenomenological quality than that of high SES individuals. Right? To put it this plainly, the boredom of the poor is different than the boredom of the elite. Right? The boredom that you have when you have too much free time, too many things to do, too many churches to go on vacation, etc. It's just going to feel very differently, judging between the two social groups. And finally, let me complete by making a case for the third pathway. And I think this is perhaps the most interesting to me, how our social standing will affect the way that we respond to boredom. And here I'm going to raise 2 suggestions. I'm sure there are better ways of thinking about this, more nuanced ways of thinking about this, but I have 2 simple ways of thinking about this link. And the first one is pretty simple, pretty obvious as well. is that boredom is going to lead to limited resources, but the amount of resources that we have at our disposal often not necessarily translated to an ability to respond to boredom. And the other way of linking them might not be that obvious, and it has to do with psychological obstacles. And I'm going to mention two. One has to do with a sense of agency or ability to be an efficacious agent, and the other one will be self-regulation. But let me start with the obvious point first, or what I take to be obvious. It might not be that obvious, might not be correct, in fact. But I think if you look at social class and social standing, the higher you are in that social ladder, the more resources you have. But I think the way we respond to the presence of boredom depends on what type and the number of opportunities that are available to us. The more opportunities we have for alternative engagement, the better we'll be able to deal with boredom when it arises. And conversely, the fewer resources we have, the fewer choices we have to respond to boredom. So we might talk about how boredom could propel one into activities that are meaningful, creative, or beneficial for oneself. But I think, that might be right. And I was thinking about these lines previously, that seems right. But it is right perhaps only for a certain group of individuals. And I think it's less likely to happen for boredom to have those beneficial outcomes for individuals of low SES. And perhaps, the benefits of boredom are benefits of privilege or social privilege instead of necessarily benefits of boredom, although I'm not quite sure, but that's one way of thinking about that. The other way of thinking about this is that low SES will give rise to certain psychological obstacles. And I'm going to mention two. The first one has to do with a crisis of agency that's characteristic of boredom. I think that makes a lot of sense. And John was presenting on this yesterday, and there's a lot of very well put articulations of this crisis of agency. It's characteristic of boredom. We just don't know what to do. We experience a need to do something, but we don't know exactly what to do. And I think this crisis of agency explains why it is so difficult for bored individuals to alleviate their feelings of boredom on their own. And it may also explain why boredom gives rise to maladaptive and harmful behaviors. Low SES, I think, will contribute and perhaps worsen the disruption of agency that's characteristic of boredom. And there are findings that suggest that there's a relationship between SES and perceived response efficacy. And specifically, the studies have found that the lower your SES is, the weaker your belief is that external and personal events are the result of your own actions, and the stronger the belief, you have a belief that such events are determined by factors that are not within your control. And so this might make, and I'm raising as a suggestive point, that because of the way that, because of our social standing, it might affect the way we think about ourselves as agents. Okay? And it might make the disruption of agency that's characteristic of boredom, might make it even worse. The last point that's related to the third pathway is that I think it is crucial to know that our regulatory abilities are key to how we're going to respond to the onset of boredom. And so having the ability to regulate our behavior, it's going to be key. It's going to allow us to respond to boredom perhaps productively or in beneficial ways. But this connection between boredom on the one hand and self-regulation on the other hand gives rise to the result that our responses to boredom will be affected by our own ability to regulate and control ourselves. But if there are any obstacles or problems, or obstacles might be the right word, to self-regulation, then we might have problems dealing with boredom. And I think in the case of poverty, we have good reasons to think that poverty will affect self-regulation. And I'm not going to go into the literature here, but there is indications that without knowing exactly the mechanism, because most of the findings are correlational, that there's decrease or lower self-regulatory abilities when you're depending on your social status. So the lower you are, the lower those self-regulatory abilities might be. And there might be excellent reasons why that might be. And in some cases, it might be an adaptive response to your social environment. But in the case of boredom, it might make it all the more harder for individuals to escape out of boredom. All right, and that concludes the third pathway, suggestive argument here that how poverty might affect our responses to boredom. All right, so let me conclude here. So I offered a model that tries to explicate the ways in which poverty may interact with boredom, and I argue that it is likely that boredom makes poverty makes boredom more frequent, changes its experience, and affects the ways in which we can respond to it. And I think boredom doesn't just invite boredom as the pathway one might suggest. It can also corrode our ability to proactively respond to it. And I take that to be an even more worrisome conclusion, if indeed it is a true conclusion. And there are clear limitations with what I've said, and so it's worth mentioning them and making them clear. I'm sure you're going to point out many more. I've been treating social class as a monolithic category, and that is not the case. And there are going to be important differences depending on what kind of social identity we have. So we're not just lower, middle, higher, upper class, but we are embodied agents, that we have a multiplicity of social identities, race, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, nationality, ethnicity, language, etc., etc. So I haven't offered an intersectional analysis, and that's going to be needed moving forward this model, making it more precise, and to be frank, making it more accurate to capture reality better, because depending on race membership and gender, there are going to be differences, even if we're talking about low SES, for instance, or middle class. And so someone who knows more, someone who's more capable, will need to help me out with that intersectional analysis. The model is, as it's pretty obvious, it's theoretical. So what I've done, I've tried to look at two different literatures, the literature on poverty and the literature on boredom, and try to find ways to suggest the links between the two, or suggest mechanisms of how one might lead to the other. And so the model is in clear need of empirical confirmation or disconfirmation. And I am a philosopher by training, so if this fails or not, I'm not going to cry if it's false. I will be interested to know why it fails, because that's how I'm going to get some results out of it. So if it works, it probably not in the way that I presented it. There are theoretical reasons to suggest that there's certain links there, but what exactly and how exactly, this all needs to be determined by capable scientists and not by myself. I'm just providing a theoretical model here. Still, just to end on a positive note, I think the model shows that accounts of boredom should take SES seriously. And I think psychological models of boredom should take SES seriously, and not just sociological accounts or anthropological accounts of boredom. And boredom seems to be a potential contributor, poverty seems to be a potential contributor to boredom, and also a formidable obstacle to our ability to respond to boredom efficiently and beneficially. And I think the model demonstrates that, or suggests strongly, that boredom is a serious matter even within the context of poverty. And so that was one of my aims, not just to say, well, we have other things to deal with in the context of poverty, let's ignore boredom. I think it's important, even and serious, even within that context. And that is because in poverty, boredom can become cruel and perhaps even unjust. So I say a scourge that afflicts more severely those who are the least capable of dealing with it, given their own social standing. So, and that is kind of the not so happy outcome of the presentation of this model, is that the boredom might turn out to be unjust in certain ways. All right, thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Andreas, for this wonderful presentation that is making us think, I'm sure. So I should give priority to your questions instead of my own. So please, Marta?
Yeah, it's actually Pavel again. Sorry about that. Again, we're
Okay.
joint account. Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I find it really interesting, and I absolutely agree with your insistence on the importance of class in boredom studies. I thought we could just touch a bit more on the issue of class as such, maybe various definitions of class. I think there's something to talk about here. And I think there's still a sort of an important distinction to be made between boredom as something that is disproportionately or particularly strongly experienced by certain classes, say the lower class. And on the other hand, the boredom is a direct result of class antagonism as such. I mean, we could either focus on boredom as something that simply, let's say, exists in the world and affects the poor in a specific way because they're poor, or maybe we could also think of boredom as something that is actively produced by the very same structures and processes that made them poor in the first place. Like, say, the constant tendency to overwork workers, directly caused by the falling rate of profit, and so on, obviously. This latter line of thinking is probably something we associate mostly with people like Adorno or Debord or Lefebvre, this sort of tradition of thinking about boredom. Boredom basically as a result of class struggle rather than a condition that is just experienced differently by different classes. And I think that whether we prioritize one perspective or the other has some far-reaching consequences for some of the other topics you touched upon. For instance, where precisely we locate the causal source of boredom among the poor, right? So is it caused by the position in the relations of exchange, the lack of resources, or is it caused primarily or originally by the way they're included in or excluded from the relations of production? So are the conditions of the labor maybe something that determines the way they experience boredom more than whether they have access to various resources afterwards? And this also shapes the way we think about the possible ways of alleviating boredom. So if boredom is the result of the same processes that made poor in the first place, then it seems that the only way for them to alleviate their boredom in a manner that would be, say, long-term and somehow profound would be to abolish this structure in general, and all other solutions would be only provisional and would only work on a very sort of superficial individual level. So I guess to a certain extent, I am asking whether poor may meaningfully address the boredom under capitalism just in general, but in more general terms, I was wondering what your opinion is about the relationship between these two possible points of view. Boredom is conditioned by class versus boredom as a result of class antagonism as such.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think you're absolutely right. And I will probably just reiterate your insight in my response. I think it's useful to distinguish between the two. And I was mostly focusing, perhaps we can call it, on the symptoms of what you call the class structure, class struggle or antagonism between classes, and also perhaps the mechanisms of capitalist global economy. And you know, I need to think about more how those exactly give rise to perhaps some of the ideas I was mentioning in the presentation, but I have to agree. I think the causes are going to be far more systemic and historical. And so alleviating, if we take seriously this idea that there is this type of boredom or more frequent boredom or different boredom that is experienced by individuals of low SES, and if we want to explore the causes, then we can't just say it's not about. I mean, clearly, anyone discussing this issue is not about personal responsibility. It has nothing to do on the personal level. There's social conditions that give rise to this, and yeah, I don't know exactly what to say other than to say you're right about the kind of the more profound systemic historical factors that are driving this. And there are different ways, and I think a lot of scholars have made similar points depending on their own background and their own expertise. So we might think, there are different ways. One way of thinking is not just necessarily the lower SES, but you can also think about the different types of jobs that are becoming available there's this category, if we accept it as a category of, let's say, of bullshit jobs, is that something that leads to more perceived meaninglessness? Why is that arises? Well, it's due to social conditions that are deep, structural, systemic, and so there's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of depth here that I haven't explored clearly, and I think if I could say my aim is kind of modest. I want to argue or show that when you focus too much on the personal level, it might be, and this is, I'm just mentioning this because I'm guilty of this. I'm absolutely guilty of this. You might forget how, you might just focus on, okay, what does boredom look like? But you might not realize that there are going to be different phases depending on who's experiencing boredom. And so that was one of my aims, just to making this, bringing this into focus. Thanks so much for that point. Excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe we could have a whole separate conference on the issue of boredom and class.
Yeah, absolutely.
On this particular topic. Thank you.
So, Keith Walker, you're the next one.
Yeah, hello. I'd just like to say, brilliant presentation. I was really excited all the way through it because my own PhD is looking at exactly what you were talking about, and the way in which there are several forms of boredom according to social factors such as class and gender. And a number of the points that you've made, I did a series of interviews and focus group interviews with school children in secondary schools, and the sort of thing that you were saying about boredom being different and its experience of boredom, the causes of boredom, and the effects of boredom changing according to social position is exactly what I found. So working class children will talk about boredom in a very, very different way than middle class children. Working class girls will talk about boredom in a very different way than the working class boys as well. So for my little sort of own little piece of research from my part of the world, everything that you were saying I found is exactly valid in my research as well. The only other thing I would add to it was that the sort of, because I was looking at a school, that the differences and the experiences and the increasing negative effect of boredom and responses to it that the lower sort of working class children made were exacerbated by an education system that we've got in this country now that values individualism and performance, and that's kind of making it worse. So that's the only thing I would add to. Brilliant. I was so excited all the way. What you were saying, it was fantastic though. That's the only thing I would add. Just an extra bit of context for children will be the education system as well. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Absolutely right. And I'm not an expert on that, but I read what is the, it will come to me, but there's a famous book about exploring the ways in which the educational system, at least in the US, and maybe North America, it's structured differently, and it supports people from middle class, higher classes, and it disadvantages people from lower classes. And so that the problems are going to be just going to be greatly magnified when we're considering things. Maybe I ask, where were you doing the interviews geographically? The location?
It's in the UK, in North Wales, in the UK, and it's secondary school. So they were children between 14 and 17, and so everybody sort of the experience of boredom was fairly universal amongst the children, but it was had different impacts, and it was sort of constructed in a different way. So middle class children, for example, they would tend to see boredom as a result of lessons that they didn't see how they focused completely on producing a grade, but that boredom didn't disengage them. It was expected and it was normal, and a degree of pain was part of the education that they knew they were going to be successful, so it didn't dissuade them. The working class children, unfortunately, their boredom kind of reconfirmed that education wasn't for them, and people like them didn't go to university, so it had a greater impact. Working class girls tended to associate boredom with not having access to friends and sociability and loneliness. So there were very different constructs for all the groups. I didn't build ethnicity into it, but it was just class and gender. But I would love to do that as well. But what you were saying was just ringing so much truth with what I'd found as well. So thank you for that. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jan, you're the next one.
Thank you, Andreas, for an excellent presentation. Very, very thoughtful and clear as always. I just wanted to sort of really thank you for, I mean, you have the ear of psychologists for good reason. And I want to thank you for sort of turning our attention to these ethical systemic issues. I think that's very important. I'm sorry if I get some of the names wrong here, but I think it was Pavel who was speaking earlier and suggesting some distinctions, which I think are very important. And in many ways, I think what you presented today was quite anchored in psychology, which is okay with me as a psychologist, but I think there are kind of broader ways to think about this. And I found the co-authored paper by Marius was a co-author on very helpful in kind of articulating these different ways of thinking about it from a sociological perspective. I look forward to seeing how this work unfolds and where it goes next. Working within the framework you did provide for us, I wonder if you have any speculative thoughts at this point about how socioeconomic status might, I'm talking about pathway 3 here, how socioeconomic status may have an impact on agency and self-regulation. I kind of see those two as being interpenetrated, you know, agency and self-regulation, but we can keep them separate if you wish. Do you have any speculative thoughts about the mechanisms of action, or is this just too early to go to that level of thought?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. I might have to disappoint. I don't know the mechanisms, and I'm not, you know, if it wasn't for all that, the issue about perhaps the contentious issues about how self-regulation works and willpower and depletion, and I don't know that literature very well, but I do know that it is a contentious issue within psychology. I might have been a little bit more daring in speculating about what the mechanisms are. So I just don't know. There's some correlational work that suggests there's going to be, that finds this relationship, but what exactly mediates or causes that, I don't know. I mean, I think there is something to be said about the way that important ways of thinking about our own self versus the environment, or how effective we are in our environment. And I think someone from a higher socioeconomical status, they're told from the beginning that they can make a difference in the world, that they have this ability to bring change. And so I think that cultivates a sense of agency from the very early on, and they can see their actions as being effective. And I think that makes a difference in how we conceive ourselves as agents. Now, whether that is going to be the same kind of agency that explains or plays a crucial role in boredom, I'm not sure. So that's all very suggestive and speculative at that. And just to address the first point, absolutely right. There are various different ways of anchoring this project. I'm very cautious, or maybe not that cautious, but I know a little bit of the psychology and I know a little bit of the philosophy of boredom. So I'm taking a little step closer to the social aspects by keeping one foot in the psychology. And maybe later on I'll be able to expand more the scope. Yeah, thank you.